President Trump in his sit-down with Chris Wallace talking about the recent midterms.
Are you ready? I won the Senate, and that's historic, too, because if you look at presidents in the White House, it's almost never happened where you won a seat. We now have 53 as opposed to 51, and we have 53 great senators in the U.S. Senate. We won. That's a tremendous victory. Nobody talks about that. That's a far greater victory than it is for the other side.
Let's put it in perspective with Dr. William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University. He is tweeting at Dr. B. Rosenberg. Hey, Bill, welcome. Good morning.
Good morning to you.
So talk about this. I saw your notes that said that maybe the media's focus that has a tone in checking Trump and his administration serves to amplify the losses that the president took in the House. How do you view the loss or the results of the midterm?
Well, I think what we have to recognize is that midterms, just so the listeners all understand, happen every 4 years. They happen in the middle of a president's term. So there won't be another midterm election until 4 years from now, even though there'll be a presidential election in 2020. The idea, though, is that in many ways Trump is correct when he's saying that he did win additional Senate seats, which is sort of unusual for most presidents. If you go back to all the way back to Dwight Eisenhower, there's only been one time in which a midterm election produced winners for the in party, and that was in George W. Bush's first term. And you have to realize that was around 9/11 when that happened. The other side of the coin, though, is that presidents routinely lose large numbers of seats of their own party in these midterms. And if you go back to Barack Obama in his first midterm, he lost 63 seats. Bush in his second term lost 32. Clinton lost 54. And if you go all the way back, for example, to Lyndon Johnson, just after he passes all that Great Society programs and Voter and Civil Rights Act legislation, he loses 47 seats. So it's really something that presidents have to sort of recognize that they're going to lose seats in the House. But this is not really a historic loss for Donald Trump in the House.
One thing about Lyndon Johnson, I just want to mention real quick, though, even though they lost, as you pointed out, 47 seats, he still kept the majority. This in the case, this was actually a flip of the majority in the House, too, right?
Yes, that's true, but it did sort of serve to put the president on notice that he was being disapproved of. And there were a lot of reasons for that. If you think about what was going on with Vietnam and everything like that. The other thing, though, I would say is that the bigger victory probably on Election Day was the Senate. If you remember, the Senate is the body that's responsible for doing treaties. They're the ones that are responsible for doing all the confirmation hearings for all of the judges. And they're also the ones that sit in terms of judgment, in terms of an impeachment process. So having Trump sort of strengthen his role in the Senate by adding a couple of seats and by adding more Trumpian-type senators as well, really emboldens him to continue to behave and act and proceed in the way that he's doing it.
That's a really important point you're making, is that if the House were to, and the House would have the first call on this, if they were to vote to impeach President Trump, the Senate would then have to have a trial. I guess they're compelled to have a trial, but obviously if you have a majority in the Senate for Republicans, it'd have to be a pretty egregious offense by the president, because quite frankly, even when Bill Clinton was impeached. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, it's a kind of thing where it depends on what side of the field you're sitting at the football game, whether or not you think the Republicans did well or the Democrats did well. But if I had my choice, I'd probably rather win the Senate than the House, because the House has a lot more members, and it may be possible to deal with maybe conservative Democrats who are going to maybe be able to be pulled along, which hasn't really happened so much with Trump. The Democrats have been remarkably consistent in holding together as a bloc in both the House and the Senate. But the Senate's really where the big issues are in play. Again, treaties, Supreme Court nominations, federal judgeships, and also impeachment.
Yeah, that's the big one right there, the Supreme Court nominees. I think that's, if nothing else, Senator Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, just cares about changing the judiciary around the country, getting those judges in place.
Right.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, for those who hadn't heard, there was a decision last week by a judge that said that, no, you have to give back. Jim Acosta has to get his press credentials back. In addition to that, this is pending, I guess, a hearing, and the White House has threatened, evidently, still to take them back, according to a letter that CNN was talking about. The White House reportedly sent a letter to Jim Acosta informing him that his pass would again be suspended after a temporary restraining order expires in 14 days. I wonder if you would sort of put this in context. The president in this conversation with Chris Wallace at Fox News sort of poo-pooed this a little bit, said, I don't think it was a big deal. I guess we have to come up with some guidelines. What do you make of all of this?
Well, I think this was a battle that got fought, although I think that the American public, when it sees that Acosta got his press credential back, thinks that it's all over. The judge actually only ruled on the fact that due process was not in place in terms of taking it away without a hearing and without sort of a legitimate process in place. They really didn't. The judge actually said the following. He says, I want to emphasize that the very limited nature of this ruling, saying it was not meant to enshrine journalists have right to access. I have not determined that the First Amendment was violated here. So it's a very narrow ruling. And ultimately, this is a political process. First of all, the president does not have to hold press conferences. So it becomes moot. I mean, no reporter could ask him a question if he doesn't hold a press conference. Second of all, the president gets to decide who he's going to allow to ask questions. So even if Acosta's in the room going forward, that doesn't mean that he's going to actually be able to ask questions, because the president could simply not call on him. So there's kind of a yin and yang here. I mean, the good news is that the press stood up for itself and basically defended its right to be there. But on the other hand, the president and Sanders, Huckabee Sanders, are in a position where they can basically control the ebb and flow of what takes place. I don't think anyone's really looking forward to the president speaking less, and in terms of having press conferences. I think we always learn a lot, not only by his tweets that come out multiple times a day, but also by what he says publicly in these press conferences. So while it was a victory, it's not necessarily a total victory, at least at this point, for the media. I mean, the media is really responsible to be that fourth estate to protect the public and let us know what's going on.
And I know you study this a lot. It seems to me, Bill, one of the key issues is not only whether or not you have access to the press briefings and access to ask questions, et cetera. It's whether or not the government can stop you from reporting. In other words, whether you're in the room with the president or with the press secretary or not is not as important as whether or not you are able to report what you say, report the truth, or report perspective that is not welcome by the White House, perhaps, but they can't stop you from doing that.
Right. I don't think actually that's what the lawsuit was addressing, though. I don't think the president or Sanders is saying the press can't report things. They just work to demean everything that people in the press who say things that they don't like try to quash it by calling it fake news. I mean, essentially, we had the defense of what happened with the president by Sanders, who produced a video, showed a video showing that Jim Acosta had sort of like bumped, moved, or physically touched the young intern who was trying to take the microphone away from him. Essentially, though, that was then found to be a doctored video by a right-wing political group. So they were providing the context of how to interpret what happened with clearly falsified information, which is really troubling when you think about the fact that this is the press secretary for the White House releasing this kind of information. It's supposed to be, an informational session where people learn about what's going on in the White House and government, and sort of providing the president's take on how this should be interpreted.
We're going to see how this one plays out. Of course, as you say, another shoe yet to drop in that. Bill Rosenberg, thanks. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, have a nice Thanksgiving, everyone. Take care.
You too, Bill. You too. Dr. William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University, joining us here discussing the midterms and this battle for the freedom of the press. He is tweeting at Dr. B. Rosenberg, at Dr. B, that is DRB, ROSENBERG.